So one thing that I will mention that I don't think I fully kind of discussed in the last lecture is kind of the point about brainstorming. So your book kind of talks about a couple of studies that have found that research doesn't really find a lot of advantages for brainstorming. Now, part of the reason for that is that generally, the group may not spend as much time generating ideas. Individuals might be kind of inhibited from sharing their ideas. And generally, rather than generating options, usually when you're brainstorming in a group, you're usually trying to spend more time talking or listening rather than generating those ideas. And so generally, we're going to find that the efficacy of that brainstorming is going to be reduced under these kinds of circumstances. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like I said, brainstorming is not necessarily the magic bullet that people think it is. You want to make sure as much as possible that people feel free enough to say their ideas, that you're focused on solutions, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the best one. That might create further inhibition. So we had step 1, diagnosing the problem. Step 2, generating solutions. Now we have to evaluate them. So once we've developed a list of potential solutions, at this point the group is going to critically evaluate each of those proposed solutions. The ones that are workable are accepted, the ones that don't are rejected. And additionally, the worst case scenario solution also needs to be considered for this to work. Step 4 is choosing the solution. So the group needs to compare solutions that are remaining, the ones that are workable, and pick the best one to implement. And there are various ways that you can go about choosing that solution. You can delegate, you can average individual inputs, you can do majority rules, or you can do a group consensus. So when we delegate, the group provides information to a chairperson who will end up making that decision. We can average individual inputs, so everybody kind of votes on their favorite 3, and we basically average those to get the group decision. With majority rules, the majority viewpoints selected. With the group consensus, you're going to discuss the options until every single person agrees unanimously on the solution. So all of these are a variety of different ways to pick a solution, and depending on the kind of group that you have, they might vary in effectiveness. If you have a group with somebody who is very much a contrarian by nature or a devil's advocate by nature, you may not get that unanimous agreement that you're hoping for. The best you may be able to hope for is majority rules. Some big pitfalls that you can experience in this step of the process, if those with power dictate the solution, the people with more power are kind of pushing other people and steamrolling other people toward that decision. Now, just because some people have more power doesn't mean that they're necessarily any more qualified to make a particular decision. When those with power end up dictating a solution, what we're going to find is that there might be a vested interest in a certain solution. So the people that want a particular solution will talk about how great it is. It'll bias the benefits. The benefits will be described as better than they actually are. For solutions that they don't want, the weaknesses will be much worse than they actually are. And all of that's being done to support the particular favored solution. So we want to try to make sure as much as possible that there aren't these kind of power grabs. And then finally, step 5, we implement the solution. So we have action steps and we develop an action plan and methods for monitoring and evaluating progress toward that solution. So that all sounds really straightforward, right? If we all followed this process, we'd all make great group decisions. But here's a problem. Just because groups make decisions don't always mean that it's done very well. And so we're going to talk about a couple of different ways that ineffective decision-making occurs. We're going to talk about process loss, and we're going to talk about groupthink. So when we talk about process gain, So when I talk about process loss, you kind of have to understand process gain. And generally, what we're going to find is that group work is generally better than what we could produce by working alone. I kind of messed around with this in social psychology in 2019 in the spring for those of you that took that class. For those of you who didn't take the class, I had kind of an example of process gain. I had half of the class basically work in a group and come up with as many creative uses as they could think of for a tire. And then I had the other half of the class, they basically had to generate their own alone. And I can't necessarily speak to the creativity of the solutions, but I can say that the students that had to work in a group generated a lot of solutions much more quickly than students who were working on their own. So this is a case of process gain. Group work will be better than what we could produce by ourselves. Typically, we'll find that having other people around us enhances our motivation and our performance. And this is what process gain is. But what we're often going to find with a lot of groups is that process gain doesn't happen. Rather, we develop what is called process loss. Groups may encounter difficulty making decisions, or they may encounter motivational issues that will lead to worse decision-making ability than if they were making the decision on their own. So process loss actually comes from a theory developed by Steiner in 1972 with his law of group performance. So the actual productivity that you see that a group produces is made up of a few different things. It is made up of the potential productivity, and then we basically have to select or subtract losses that are due to faulty processes. So what this means is that if you have any degree of process loss, you are losing potential productivity, and whatever you're coming up with, whether it's an outcome or a solution, would not be as good as the potential that you had. So process loss is any non-motivational element of a group situation that will detract from performance. This will include coordination problems, communication issues. I've often seen in classes with group problems, with group projects that don't really work, it's because there's always one member that is really, really hard to get in touch with. Another thing we may find that can be an issue is hoarding unshared information. So what individual factors can affect group processes? This will include different member characteristics, including knowledge, skills, abilities, those KSAOs that we talked about before. So those can affect group processes. If you've got group members that are not, don't really have the knowledge to be able to implement solutions, you're going to encounter process loss. This may also include personality factors. Somebody who is extroverted is probably going to be energized by being in a group. That will enhance motivation and can potentially enhance performance. If you enjoy group work, this is going to enhance your performance. Additionally, depending on the type of task that you're doing, communication is going to be key across different types of skill sets. So in an assembly line, a lot of this communication is going to be about what's going on the line. Are there any problems with the line? Versus a surgery team where you're going to have to constantly be communicating about what you're seeing, what we need to try, what we need to do, and so on. And the type of task that you're doing will also affect whether or not process loss happens. So here are some different types of task factors that need to be considered. The first is task division. Is everybody in the group working together on a unified whole or a unified task? Or are we dividing this project up into different smaller tasks to delegate to individuals? So is the task divided or is the task unitary? This is going to have an effect. When we're combining our individual efforts, do they sum together or are they being averaged? So when I am looking at group performance, do I give the entire group an average based on what's produced, or do I add up the individual contributions of that effort? With group performance, is it disjunctive or is it conjunctive? So in a disjunctive task, generally we're going to find that group performance is going to basically be determined by the best individual person. So for problem solving skills or for trivia or things like that, the performance is largely going to be defined by the person who's doing the best. Now, on the other hand, a conjunctive task might be something like group mountain climbing. In this case, your performance is not defined by the person who is doing the best, but it's going to be defined by your weakest person. So we can also talk about how we're considering the output that's produced. So if we're dealing with something that is considered an inelective task, this is basically the ability of a group to make a particular decision or a judgment, and we're going to measure and assess how good that is by looking at either the processes that the group uses to make that decision, like how a jury decides a verdict, or the quality of the decision. So how well did this group solve this problem? Like if y'all were doing the NASA task, did you pick the right items that you would need when you're stranded on the moon? Now, on the other hand, a maximizing task is going to occur when we're measuring how rapidly the group is working or how much of a product that they're actually able to produce. And we're basically going to assess that in terms of how much they can produce or how quickly they can produce the output. And then finally, we can... One of the things for these intellective tasks, where we're looking at the processes or the quality of the decision that's made, we can either do what is called a criterion task or a judgmental task. With a criterion task, the group is going to see that there is a clearly correct solution to the problem. On the other hand, a judgmental task, there is no correct answer. So it's all about using one's best judgment. So these are a variety of different task factors that can absolutely affect and modify the way that a group makes decisions. Don't worry, I'm not necessarily going to test you on these specific factors. I will not ask you what maximizing versus inelective is, but I do think it's important to note that the type of task that you're doing and what the task values and whether or not the task is defined by the best person in your group or the worst person in your group is going to play a role on the types of decisions that you make and whether or not you experience process loss. Okay, so process loss can also be due to poor coordination or poor motivation. Now, I've already talked about some of the different factors that can affect a group's decision-making abilities or a group's output that have nothing to do with motivation, but motivation can also play a role. Now, I've already talked a little bit about social loafing with the research by Ringelmann. But it turns out that there's kind of a related idea called the Ringelmann effect. And generally what we're going to find is that the more people that are involved in your group, the harder it is to actually work together. So here you kind of see a number of workers and then you have performance. You can see that the more workers that you add, you'll kind of notice that the performance kind of asymptotes to a point, kind of reaches its asymptote around 6 people. But notice that with every additional worker you have and that you add to this group, the greater the discrepancy between your expected performance and your actual performance. And that's just because more people makes things more difficult. That's more people you have to coordinate with, more people you have to persuade, more people you have to discuss with, and so on. Additionally, self-concern and being focused on yourself rather than this group decision can also lead to poor motivation as well as social loafing. And then additionally, process loss can happen because of things related to groupthink due to this pressure to not really rock the boat. So this was originally developed by Irving Janis in 1972 and later clarified in 2007. So groupthink is basically when a poor group decision is being made because of flawed group processes and strong pressure to conform with the group. So typically we're going to tend to find that groupthink is a lot more likely to happen when these kind of antecedents are in play. So if there's time pressure and stress, That is certainly an antecedent. We may not necessarily make the best decision in those instances. If the group is very highly cohesive, so again, this is another case where high group cohesion may actually present more of a problem than a solution. If you get your social identity from being a part of this group, that's going to make this more likely. Typically, we're going to find as these groups become more cohesive, they tend to isolate themselves from other sources of information. They don't necessarily want information from outsiders. And additionally, we'll tend to find that this is more likely when the leadership of this group is very directive. They tell you what to do and clearly authoritative. There's one person in charge, they make the rules, nobody questions it. So all of these are very strong antecedent conditions to groupthink developing. Now, what are some of the different symptoms of groupthink? We will have an illusion of invulnerability, the idea that the group is the most important thing and they never make a mistake and we make all the right decisions. There's an illusion of unanimity, the idea that everybody agrees, even if that's not necessarily the case. It's possible that other people in the group may not agree, but because of this strong cohesion and because of pressure to conform, people who disagree may not say anything. There's clear in-group favoritism. We like people who are in the group. We agree with people who are in the group. The people who are outside of the group do not matter. Typically, because of this, there's going to be little search for new information. There's a belief in the morality of the group. We are doing what's right. We're doing the right thing. We're doing the good thing. We're the good guys. There's pressure on dissenters to conform to group norms. This may occur by basically appointing what are called mind guards. These people are members of the group whose job it basically is, if they think there's even an idea of dissent, they are going to strongly pressure that dissenter to basically get back in line with the group or threaten them with ostracism from the group. And because this group is so strongly cohesive, there's going to be a lot of pressure for that person to agree because they don't want to get kicked out of the group. And because of this, poor decision making can result. Now, process loss can also happen because of poor communication. Not everybody in the group may have all of the information that is necessary. And so what ends up happening because of this is that the groups may end up spending more time sharing information that everybody already knows rather than sharing information that not everybody does. They may choose to ignore information that only a few people know. Now, getting back to groupthink, and I kind of jumped around a little bit, when a group is so cohesive, that desire to agree may be so strong that it ends up preventing the group from making an appropriate decision. An example of this is Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The military in Hawaii were actually provided with information about the buildup to attack. It wasn't taken seriously, and there was no strategic placement of aircraft carriers in the Pacific to provide a warning. And so it ended up taking quite a few people by surprise. You could say that similar cases have been made for the events of September 11th, another case where we had information ahead of time, and some would even argue the current outbreak of coronavirus, which was already starting to land on people's radars as early as late December 2019 and early January 2020. As I've kind of mentioned, these antecedents of groupthink do include strong cohesion, as we've discussed. This is more likely in groups that choose to isolate themselves from others, strong biased leadership that dictates the direction of the group, that strong, directive, authoritative leadership, and high decisional stress. If the decision needs to be made quickly, and if the context is very strongly emotionally charged, you're going to be more likely to fall into this. As I kind of mentioned some of these symptoms before, I mentioned the invulnerability, the unanimity, pressure on dissenters, mind guards. Not only are they trying to quash dissent within the group, they're trying to protect the group from outside opinions. We will have rationalizing, we're doing the right thing, rationalizing why we're making these bad decisions, stereotyping anybody that's outside of the group, self-censorship, and I've kind of mentioned the illusion of morality. So how can we improve these different group processes? I'm going to stop here. We'll talk about it next time.